Otho. The new emperor went early in the morning to the capital and sacrificed, and having commanded Marius Celsus to be brought, he saluted him, and with obliging language desired him rather to forget his accusation than remember his acquittal, to which Celsus answered neither meanly nor ungratefully, that his very crime ought to recommend his integrity, since his guilt had been his fidelity to Galba, from whom he had never received any personal obligations, upon which they were both of them admired by those that were present, and applauded by the soldiers. In the Senate, Otho said much in a gentle and popular strain. He was to have been consul for part of that year himself, but he gave the office to Virginius Rufus, and displaced none that had been named for the consulship by either Nero or Galba. Those that were remarkable for their age and dignity he promoted to the priesthoods, and restored the remains of their fortunes, that had not yet been sold, to all those senators that were banished by Nero and recalled by Galba. So that the nobility and chief of the people, who were at first apprehensive that no human creature, but some supernatural penal or vindictive power had seized the empire, began now to flatter themselves with hopes of a government that smiled upon them thus early. Besides, nothing gratified or gained the whole Roman people more than his justice in relation to Tigellinus. It was not seen how he was in fact already suffering punishment, not only by the very terror of retribution which he saw the whole city requiring as a just debt, but with several incurable diseases also, not to mention those unhallowed frightful excesses upon impure and prostituted women, to which, at the very close of life, his lewd nature clung, and in them gasped out, as it were, its last. These, in the opinion of all reasonable men, being themselves the extremest punishment and equal to many deaths. But it was felt like a grievance by people in general that he continued yet to see the light of day, who had been the occasion of the loss of it to so many persons, and such persons as had died by his means. Wherefore Otho ordered him to be sent for, just as he was contriving his escape by means of some vessels that lay ready for him on the coast near where he lived, in the neighborhood of Sinuessa. At first he endeavored to corrupt the messenger by a large sum of money, to favor his design, but when he found this was to no purpose, he made him as considerable a present as if he had really connived at it, only entreating him to stay till he had shaved, and so took that opportunity, and with his razor dispatched himself. And while giving the people this most righteous satisfaction of their desires, for himself he seemed to have no sort of regard for any private injuries of his own, and at first, to please the populace, he did not refuse to be called Nero in the theatre, and did not interfere when some persons displayed Nero's statues to public view. And Cluvius Rufus says, imperial letters, such as are sent with couriers, went into Spain with the name of Nero affixed adoptively to that of Otho. But as soon as he perceived this gave offense to the chief and most distinguished citizens, it was omitted. After he had begun to model the government in this manner, the paid soldiers began to murmur, and endeavored to make him suspect and chastise the nobility, either really out of a concern for his safety, or wishing upon this pretense to stir up trouble and warfare. Thus, whilst Crispinus, whom he had ordered to bring him the 17th cohort from Ostia, began to collect what he wanted after it was dark, and was putting the arms upon the wagons, some of the most turbulent cried out that Crispinus was disaffected, that the Senate was practicing something against the emperor, and that those arms were to be employed against Caesar and not for him. When this report was once set afoot, it got the belief and excited the passions of many. They broke out into violence. Some seized the wagons, and others slew Crispinus and 2 centurions that opposed them. And the whole number of them, arraying themselves in their arms, and encouraging one another to stand by Caesar, marched to Rome. And hearing there that 80 of the senators were at supper with Otho, they flew to the palace, and declared it was a fair opportunity to take off Caesar's enemies at one stroke. A general alarm ensued of an immediate coming sack of the city. All were in confusion about the palace, and Otho himself in no small consternation, being not only concerned for the senators, some of whom had brought their wives to supper thither, but also feeling himself to be an object of alarm and suspicion to them, whose eyes he saw fixed on him in silence and terror. Therefore he gave orders to the prefects to address the soldiers and do their best to pacify them, while he bade the guests rise and leave by another door. They had only just made their way out, when the soldiers rushed into the room and called out, "Where are Caesar's enemies?" Then Otho, standing up on his couch, made use both of arguments and entreaties, and by actual tears at last, with great difficulty, persuaded them to desist. The next day he went to the camp, and distributed a bounty of 1,250 drachmas a man amongst them, then commended them for the regard and zeal they had for his safety, but told them that there were some who were intriguing among them, who not only accused his own clemency, but had also misrepresented their loyalty, and therefore he desired their assistance in doing justice upon them. To which, when they all consented, he was satisfied with the execution of 2 only, whose deaths he knew would be regretted by no one man in the whole army. Such conduct, so little expected from him, was rewarded by some with gratitude and confidence. Others looked upon his behavior as a course to which necessity drove him, to gain the people to the support of the war. For now there were certain tidings that Vitellius had assumed the sovereign title and authority, and frequent expresses brought accounts of new accessions to him. Others, however, came announcing that the Pannonian, Dalmatian, and Moesian legions, with their officers, adhered to Otho. Ere long also came favorable letters from Mucianus and Vespasian, generals of 2 formidable armies, the one in Syria, the other in Judea, to assure him of their firmness to his interest. In confidence whereof he was so exalted that he wrote to Vitellius not to attempt anything beyond his post, and offered him large sums of money and a city, where he might live his time out in pleasure and ease. These overtures at first were responded to by Vitellius with equivocating civilities, which soon, however, turned into an interchange of angry words, and letters passed between the two, conveying bitter and shameful terms of reproach, which were not false indeed for that matter, only it was senseless and ridiculous for each to assail the other with accusations to which both alike must plead guilty. For it were hard to determine which of the two had been most profuse, most effeminate, which was the most a novice in military affairs, and most involved in debt through previous want of means. As to the prodigies and apparitions that happened about this time, there were many reported which none could answer for, or which were told in different ways, but one which everybody actually saw with their eyes was the statue in the Capitol of Victory carried in a chariot, with the reins dropped out of her hands, as if she were grown too weak to hold them any longer, and a second, that Caius Caesar's statue in the island of Tiber, without any earthquake or wind to account for it, turned round from east to west, and this, they say, happened about the time when Vespasian and his party first openly began to put themselves forward. Another incident, which the people in general thought an evil sign, was the inundation of the Tiber. For though it happened at a time when rivers are usually at their fullest, yet such height of water and so tremendous a flood had never been known before, nor such a destruction of property, great part of the city being under water, and especially the corn market, so that it occasioned a great dearth for several days. But when news was now brought that Caecina and Valens, coming for Vitellius, had possessed themselves of the Alps, Otho sent Dolabella, a patrician who was suspected by the soldiery of some ill design, for whatever reason, whether it were fear of him or of anyone else, to the town of Aquinum, to give encouragement there, and proceeding then to choose which of the magistrates should go with him to the war, he named among the rest Lucius, Vitellius's brother, without distinguishing him by any new marks either of his favor or displeasure. He also took the greatest precautions for Vitellius's wife and mother, that they might be safe and free from all apprehension for themselves. He made Flavius Sabinus, Vespasian's brother, governor of Rome, either in honor to the memory of Nero, who had advanced him formerly to that command, which Galba had taken away, or else to show his confidence in Vespasian by his favor to his brother. After he came to Brixellum, a town of Italy near the Po, he stayed behind himself and ordered the army to march under the conduct of Marius Celsus, Suetonius Paulinius, Gallus, and Spurina, all men of experience and reputation, but unable to carry their own plans and purposes into effect by reason of the ungovernable temper of the army, which would take orders from none but the emperor, whom they themselves had made their master. Nor was the enemy under much better discipline, the soldiers there also being haughty and disobedient upon the same account, but they were more experienced and used to hard work, whereas Otho's men were soft from their long, easy living and lack of service, having spent most of their time in theaters and at state shows and on the stage. While moreover, they tried to cover their deficiencies by arrogance and vain display, pretending to decline their duty, not because they were unable to do the thing commanded, but because they thought themselves above it, so that Spurina had like to be cut in pieces for attempting to force them to their work. They assailed him with insolent language, accusing him of a design to betray and ruin Caesar's interest. Nay, some of them that were in drink forced his tent in the night, and demanded money for the expenses of their journey, which they must at once take, they said, to the emperor to complain of him. However, the contemptuous treatment they met with at Placentia did for the present good service to Spurina and to the cause of Otho. For Vitellius's men marched up to the walls, and upbraided Otho's upon the ramparts, calling them players, dancers, idle spectators of Pythian and Olympic games, but novices in the art of war, who never so much as looked on at a battle, mean souls, that triumphed in the beheading of Galba, an old man unarmed, but had no desire to look real enemies in the face. Which reproaches so inflamed them that they kneeled at Spurina's feet, entreated him to give his orders, and assured him no danger or toil should be too great or too difficult for them. Whereupon, when Vitellius's forces made a vigorous attack on the town, and brought up numerous engines against the walls, the besieged bravely repulsed them, and repelling the enemy with great slaughter, secured the safety of a noble city, one of the most flourishing places in Italy. Besides, it was observed that Otho's officers were much more inoffensive, both towards the public and to private men, than to those of Vitellius, among whom was Caecina, who used neither the language nor the apparel of a citizen, an overbearing, foreign-seeming man, of gigantic stature, and always dressed in trews and sleeves, after the manner of the Gauls, whilst he conversed with Roman officials and magistrates. His wife, too, travelled along with him, riding in splendid attire on horseback, with a chosen body of cavalry to escort her. And Fabius Valens, the other general, was so rapacious that neither what he plundered from enemies, nor what he stole or got as gifts and bribes from his friends and allies, could satisfy his wishes. And it was said that it was in order to have time to raise money that he had marched so slowly that he was not present at the former attack. But some lay blame on Caecina, saying that out of a desire to gain the victory by himself before Fabius joined him, he committed sundry other errors of lesser consequence, and by engaging unseasonably, and when he could not do so thoroughly, he very nearly brought all to ruin. When he found himself beat off at Placentia, he set off to attack Cremona, another large and rich city. In the meantime, Annius Gallus marched to join Spurina at Placentia, but having intelligence that the siege was raised, and that Cremona was in danger, he turned to its relief, and encamped just by the enemy, where he was daily reinforced by other officers. Caecina placed a strong ambush of heavy infantry in some rough and woody country, and gave orders to his horse to advance, and if the enemy should charge them, then to make a slow retreat, and draw them into the snare. But his stratagem was discovered by some deserters to Celsus, who attacked with a good body of horse, but followed the pursuit cautiously, and succeeded in surrounding and routing the troops in the ambuscade. And if the infantry, which he ordered up from the camp, had come soon enough to sustain the horse, Caecina's whole army, in all appearance, had been totally routed. But Paulinus, moving too slowly, was accused of acting with a degree of needless caution not to have been expected from one of his reputation, so that the soldiers incensed Otho against him, accused him of treachery, and boasted loudly that the victory had been in their power, and that if it was not complete, it was owing to the mismanagement of their generals, all which Otho did not so much believe as he was willing to appear not to disbelieve. He therefore sent his brother Titianus with Proculus, the prefect of the guards, to the army, where the latter was general in reality, and the former in appearance. Celsus and Paulinus had the title of friends and counselors with not the least authority or power. At the same time, there was nothing but quarrel and disturbance amongst the enemy, especially where Valens commanded. For the soldiers here, being informed of what had happened at the ambuscade, were enraged because they had not been permitted to be present to strike a blow in defense of the lives of so many men that had died in that action. Valens, with much difficulty, quieted their fury, after they had now begun to throw missiles at him, and quitting his camp, joined Caecina. About this time Otho came to Bedriacum, a little town near Cremona, to the camp, and called a council of war, where Proculus and Titianus declared for giving battle, while the soldiers were flushed with their late success, saying they ought not to lose their time and opportunity, and present height of strength, and wait for Vitellius to arrive out of Gaul. But Paulinus told them that the enemy's whole force was present, and that there was no body of reserve behind, but that Otho, if he would not be too precipitate, and choose the enemy's time instead of his own for the battle, might expect reinforcements out of Moesia and Pannonia, not inferior in numbers to the troops that were already present. He thought it probable, too, that the soldiers, who were then in heart before they were joined, would not be less so when the forces were all come up. Besides, the deferring battle could not be inconvenient to them that were sufficiently provided with all necessaries. But the others, being in an enemy's country, must needs be exceedingly straitened in a little time. Marius Celsus was of Paulinus's opinion. Annius Gallus, being absent and under the surgeon's hands through a fall from his horse, was consulted by letter, and advised Otho to stay for those legions that were marching from Moesia. But after all he did not follow the advice, and the opinion of those that declared for a battle prevailed. There are several reasons given for this determination, but the most apparent is this, that the Praetorian soldiers, as they are called, who serve as guards, not relishing the military discipline which they now had begun a little more to experience, and longing for their amusements and unwarlike life among the shows of Rome, would not be commanded, but were eager for a battle, imagining that upon the first onset they should carry all before them. Otho also himself seems not to have shown the proper fortitude in bearing up against the uncertainty, and out of effeminacy and want of use had not patience for the calculations of danger, and was so uneasy at the apprehension of it that he shut his eyes, and like one going to leap from a precipice, left everything to fortune. This is the account Secundus the rhetorician, who was his secretary, gave of the matter. But others, who would tell you that there were many movements in both armies for acting in concert, as if it were possible for them to agree, then they should proceed to choose one of their most experienced officers that were present. If not, they should convene the Senate, and invest it with the power of election. And it is not improbable that neither of the emperors then bearing the title, having really any reputation, such purposes were really entertained among the genuine, serviceable, and sober-minded part of the soldiers. For what could be more odious and unreasonable than that the evils which the Roman citizens had formerly thought it so lamentable to inflict upon each other for the sake of a Sylla or a Marius, a Caesar or a Pompey, should now be undergone anew for the object of letting the empire pay the expenses of the gluttony and intemperance of Vitellius, or the looseness and effeminacy of Otho. It is thought that Celsus, upon such reflections, protracted the time in order to a possible accommodation, and that Otho pushed on things to an extremity to prevent it. He himself returned to Brixillum, which was another false step, both because he withdrew from the combatants all the motives of respect and a desire to gain his favor, which his presence would have supplied, and because he weakened the army by detaching some of his best and most faithful troops for his horse and foot guards. About the same time also happened a skirmish on the Po, As Caecina was laying a bridge over it, Otho's men attacked him and tried to prevent it. And when they did not succeed, on their putting into their boats torchwood with a quantity of sulfur and pitch, the wind on the river suddenly caught their material that they had prepared against the enemy and blew it into a light. First came smoke and then a clear flame, and the men, getting into great confusion and jumping overboard, upset the boats and put themselves ludicrously at the mercy of their enemies. Also the Germans attacked Otho's gladiators upon a small island in the river, routed them, and killed a good many. All which made the soldiers at Bedriacum full of anger and eagerness to be led to battle. So Proculus led them out of Bedriacum to a place 50 furlongs off, where he pitched his camp so ignorantly, and with such a ridiculous want of foresight, that the soldiers suffered extremely for want of water, though it was the springtime, and the plains all around were full of running streams and rivers that never dried up. The next day he proposed to attack the enemy, first making a march of not less than 100 furlongs. But to this Paulinus objected, saying they ought to wait, and not immediately after a journey engage men who have been standing in their arms and arranging themselves for battle at their leisure, whilst they were making a long march with all their beasts of burden and their camp followers to encumber them. As the generals were arguing about this matter, a Numidian courtier came from Otho with orders to lose no time but give battle. Accordingly they consented and moved. As soon as Caecina had notice, he was much surprised, and quitted his post on the river to hasten to the camp. In the meantime the men had armed themselves mostly, and were receiving the word from Valens. So while the legions took up their position, they sent out the best of their horse in advance. Otho's foremost troops, upon some groundless rumor, took up the notion that the commanders on the other side would come over, and accordingly, upon their first approach, they saluted them with the friendly title of fellow soldiers. But the others returned the compliment with anger and disdainful words, which not only disheartened those that had given the salutation, but excited suspicions of their fidelity amongst the others on their side, who had not. This caused a confusion at the very first onset, and nothing else that followed was done upon any plan. The baggage carriers, mingling up with the fighting men, created great disorder and division, as well as the nature of the ground, the ditches and pits in which were so many, that they were forced to break their ranks to avoid and go round them, and so to fight without order and in small parties. There were but 2 legions, one of Vitellius's, called the Ravenous, and another of Otho's, called the Assistant, that got out into the open outspread level and engaged in proper form, fighting one main body against the other for some length of time. Otho's men were strong and bold, but had never been in battle before. Vitellius's had seen many wars, but were old and past their strength. So Otho's legion charged boldly, drove back their opponents, and took the eagle, killing pretty nearly every man in the first rank, till the others, full of rage and shame, returned the charge, slew Orphidius, the commander of the legion, and took several standards. Varus Alphinus, with his Batavians, who are the natives of an island of the Rhine, and are esteemed the best of the German horse, fell upon the gladiators, who had a reputation both for valor and skill in fighting. Some few of these did their duty, but the greatest part of them made towards the river, and falling in with some cohorts stationed there, were cut off. But none behaved so ill as the Praetorians, who, without ever so much as meeting the enemy, ran away, broke through their own body that stood, and put them into disorder. Notwithstanding this, many of Otho's men routed those that were opposed to them, broke right into them, and forced their way to the camp through the very middle of their conquerors. As for their commanders, neither Proculus nor Paulinus ventured to re-enter with the troops. They turned aside, and avoided the soldiers, who had already charged the miscarriage upon their officers. Annius Gallus received into the town and rallied the scattered parties, and encouraged them with an assurance that the battle was a drawn one, and the victory had in many parts been theirs. Marius Celsus, collecting the officers, urged the public interest. Otho himself, if he were a brave man, would not, after such an expensive Roman blood, attempt anything further, especially since even Cato and Scipio, though the liberty of Rome was then at stake, had been accused of being too prodigal of so many brave men's lives as were lost in Africa, rather than submit to Caesar after the battle of Pharsalia had gone against them. For though all persons are equally subject to the caprice of fortune, yet all good men have one advantage she cannot deny, which is this: to act reasonably under misfortunes. This language was well accepted amongst the officers, who sounded the private soldiers and found them desirous of peace. And Titianus also gave directions that envoys should be sent in order to a treaty. And accordingly it was agreed that the conference should be between Celsus and Gallus on one part, and Valens with Caecina on the other. As the two first were upon their journey, they met some centurions, who told them that troops were already in motion, marching for Bedriacum, but that they themselves were deputed by their generals to carry proposals for an accommodation. Celsus and Gallus expressed their approval, and requested them to turn back and carry them to Caecina. However, Celsus, upon his approach, was in danger from the vanguard, who happened to be some of the horse that had suffered at the ambush. For as soon as they saw him, they hallooed, and were coming down upon him, but the centurions came forward to protect him, and the other officers crying out and bidding them desist, Caecina came up to inform himself of the tumult, which he quieted, and giving a friendly greeting to Celsus, took him in his company and proceeded towards Bedriacum. Titianus, meantime, had repented of having sent the messengers, and placed those of the soldiers who were more confident upon the walls once again, bidding the others also go and support them. But when Caecina rode up on his horse and held out his hand, no one did or said to the contrary. Those on the walls greeted his men with salutations. Others opened the gates and went out, and mingled freely with those they met. And instead of acts of hostility, there were nothing but mutual shaking of hands and congratulations, everyone taking the oaths and submitting to Vitellius. This is the account which the most of those that were present at the battle give of it, yet owned that the disorder they were in, and the absence of any unity of action, would not give them leave to be certain as to particulars. And when I myself travelled afterwards over the field of battle, Mestrius Florus, a man of consular degree, one of those who had been, not willingly, but by command, in attendance on Otho at the time, pointed out to me an ancient temple, and told me that as he went that way after the battle, he observed a heap of bodies piled up there to such a height that those on the top of it touched the pinnacles of the roof. How it came to be so, he could neither discover himself nor learn from any other person. As indeed he said, in civil wars it generally happens that greater numbers are killed when an army is routed, quarter not being given, because captives are of no advantage to the conquerors. But why the carcasses should be heaped up after that manner is not easy to determine. Otho at first, as it frequently happens, received some uncertain rumors of the issue of the battle. But when some of the wounded that returned from the field informed him rightly of it, it is not indeed so much to be wondered at that his friends should bid him not give up all as lost or let his courage sink. But the feeling shown by the soldiers is something that exceeds all belief. There was not one of them would either go over to the conqueror or show any disposition to make terms for himself, as if their leader's cause was desperate. On the contrary, they crowded his gates, called out to him with the title of emperor, and as soon as he appeared, cried out and entreated him, catching hold of his hand, and throwing themselves upon the ground, and with all the moving language of tears and persuasion, besought him to stand by them, not abandon them to their enemies, but employ in his service their lives and persons, which would not cease to be his so long as they had breath. So urgent was their zealous and universal importunity. And one obscure and private soldier, after he had drawn his sword, addressed himself to Otho. By this, Caesar, judge our fidelity. There is not a man amongst us but would strike thus to serve you. And so stabbed himself. Notwithstanding this, Otho stood serene and unshaken, and with a face full of constancy and composure, turned himself about and looked at them, replying thus: This day, my fellow soldiers, which gives me such proofs of your affection, is preferable even to that on which you saluted me emperor. Deny me not, therefore, the yet higher satisfaction of laying down my life for the preservation of so many brave men. In this at least let me be worthy of the empire, that is, to die for it. I am of opinion the enemy has neither gained an entire nor a decisive victory. I have advised that the Moesian army is not many days' journey distant on its march to the Adriatic. Asia, Syria, and Egypt, and the legions that are serving against the Jews declare for us. The Senate is also with us, and the wives and children of our opponents are in our power. But alas, it is not in defense of Italy against Hannibal or Pyrrhus or the Cimbri that we fight. Romans combat here against Romans. And whether we conquer or are defeated, our country suffers and we commit a crime. Victory, to whichever it fall, is gained at her expense. Believe it many times over, I can die with more honor than I can reign. For I cannot see at all how I should do any such great good to my country by gaining the victory as I shall by dying to establish peace and unanimity and to save Italy from such another unhappy day. As soon as he had done, he was resolute against all manner of argument or persuasion, and taking leave of his friends and the senators that were present, he bade them depart, and wrote to those that were absent, and sent letters to the towns, that they might have every honor and facility in their journey. Then he sent for Cocceius, his brother's son, who was yet a boy, and bade him be in no apprehension of Vitellius, whose mother and wife and family he had treated with the same tenderness as his own, and also told him that this had been his reason for delaying to adopt him, which he had meant to do, as his son. He had desired that he might share his power if he conquered, but not be involved in his ruin if he failed. Take notice, he added, my boy, of these my last words, that you neither too negligently forget nor too zealously remember that Caesar was your uncle. By and by he heard a tumult amongst the soldiers at the door, who were treating the senators with menaces for preparing to withdraw, upon which, out of regard to their safety, he showed himself once more in public, but not with a gentle aspect and in a persuading manner as before. On the contrary, with a countenance that discovered indignation and authority, he commanded such as were disorderly to leave the place, and was not disobeyed. It was now evening, and feeling thirsty, he drank some water, and then took 2 daggers that belonged to him, and when he had carefully examined their edges, he laid one of them down, and put the other in his robe, under his arm, then called his servants, and distributed some money amongst them, but not inconsiderably, nor like one too lavish of what was not his own. For to some he gave more, to others less, all strictly in moderation, and distinguishing every one's particular merit. When this was done, he dismissed them, and passed the rest of the night in so sound a sleep that the officers of his bedchamber heard him snore. In the morning he called for one of his freedmen, who had assisted him in arranging about the senators, and bade him bring him an account if they were safe. Being informed that they were all well and wanted nothing, "Go then," said he, "and show yourself to the soldiers, lest they should cut you in pieces for being accessory to my death." As soon as he was gone, he held his sword upright under him with both his hands, and falling upon it, expired with no more than one single groan, to express his sense of the pang, or to inform those that waited without. When his servants, therefore, raised their exclamations of grief, the whole camp and city were at once filled with lamentation. The soldiers immediately broke in at the doors with a loud cry in passionate distress, and accusing themselves that they had been so negligent in looking after that life which was laid down to preserve theirs. Nor would a man of them quit the body to secure his own safety with the approaching enemy, but having raised a funeral pile and attired the body, they bore it thither, arrayed in their arms, those among them greatly exulting, who succeeded in getting first under the bier and becoming its bearers. Of the others, some threw themselves down before the body and kissed his wound, others grasped his hand, and others that were at a distance knelt down to do him obeisance. There were some who, after putting their torches to the pile, slew themselves, though they had not, so far as appeared, either any particular obligations to the dead, or reason to apprehend ill usage from the victor. Simply, it would seem, no king, legal or illegal, had ever been possessed with so extreme and vehement a passion to command others, as was that of these men to obey Otho. Nor did their love of him cease with his death. It survived, and changed ere long into a mortal hatred to his successor, as will be shown in its proper place. They placed the remains of Otho in the earth, and raised over them a monument, which neither by its size nor the pomp of its inscription might excite hostility. I myself have seen it at Brixellum, a plain structure, and the epitaph only this: to the memory of Marcus Otho. He died in his 38th year, after a short reign of about 3 months, his death being as much applauded as his life was censured. For if he lived not better than Nero, he died more nobly. The soldiers were displeased with Pollio, one of their 2 prefects, who bade them immediately swear allegiance to Vitellius. And when they understood that some of the senators were still upon the spot, they made no opposition to the departure of the rest, but only distributed the tranquillity of Virginius Rufus with an offer of the government. And moving in one body to his house in arms, they first entreated him, and then demanded of him to accept of the empire, or at least to be their mediator. But he, that refused to command them when conquerors, thought it ridiculous to pretend to it now they were beat, and was unwilling to go as their envoy to the Germans, whom in past time he had compelled to do various things that they had not liked. And for these reasons he slipped away through a private door. As soon as the soldiers perceived this, they owned Vitellius, and so got their pardon and served under Caecina. Theseus, flying by sea to Athens, alien and all his... There is a story given differing from the rest, where he writes that Theseus, being driven by a storm upon the isle of Cyprus, and having aboard with him Ariadne, big with child, and extremely discomposed with the rolling of the sea, set her on shore, and left her there alone, to return himself and help the ship, when, on a sudden, a violent wind carried him again out to sea. That the women of the island received Ariadne very kindly, and did all they could to console and alleviate her distress at being left behind. That they counterfeited kind letters, and delivered them to her, as sent from Theseus, and, when she fell in labor, were diligent in performing to her every needful service, but that she died before she could be delivered, and was honorably interred. That soon after Theseus returned, and was greatly afflicted for her loss, and at his departure left a sum of money among the people of the island, ordering them to do sacrifice to Ariadne, and caused 2 little images to be made and dedicated to her, one of silver and the other of brass. Moreover, that on the 2nd day of Gorpiaius, which is sacred to Ariadne, they have this ceremony among their sacrifices, to have a youth lie down, and with his voice and gesture represent the pains of a woman in travail, and that the Amathusians call the grove in which they show her tomb the grove of Venus Ariadne. Differing yet from this account, some of the Naxians write that there were 2 Minuses and 2 Ariadnes, one of whom they say was married to Bacchus in the isle of Naxos, and bore the children Staphylus and his brother, but that the other, of a later age, was carried off by Theseus, and being afterwards deserted by him, retired to Naxos with her nurse Corcina, whose grave they yet show. That this Ariadne also died there, and was worshipped by the island, but in a different manner from the former. For her day is celebrated with general joy and revelling, but all the sacrifices performed to the latter are attended with mourning and gloom. Now Theseus, in his return from Crete, put in at Delos, and having sacrificed to the god of the island, dedicated to the temple the image of Venus, which Ariadne had given him, and danced with the young Athenians a dance that, in memory of him, they say is still preserved among the inhabitants of Delos, consisting in certain measured turnings and returnings, imitative of the windings and twistings of the labyrinth. And this dance, as Dicaearchus writes, is called among the Delians the crane. This he danced round the Ceratonian altar, so called from its consisting of horns taken from the left side of the head. They say also that he instituted games in Delos, where he was the first that began the custom of giving a palm to the victors. When they were come near the coast of Attica, so great was the joy for the happy success of their voyage, that neither Theseus himself nor the pilot remembered to hang out the sail, which should have been the token of their safety, to Aegeus, who, in despair at the sight, threw himself headlong from a rock and perished in the sea. But Theseus, being arrived at the port of Phalerum, paid there the sacrifices which he had vowed to the gods at his setting out to sea, and sent a herald to the city to carry the news of his safe return. At his entrance, the herald found the people, for the most part, full of grief for the loss of their king. Others, as may well be believed, as full of joy for the tidings that he brought, and eager to welcome him and crown him with garlands for his good news, which he indeed accepted of, but hung them upon his herald's staff, and thus returning to the seaside before Theseus had finished his libation to the gods, he stayed apart for fear of disturbing the holy rites. But as soon as the libation was ended, went up and related the king's death, upon the hearing of which, with great lamentations and a confused tumult of grief, they ran with all haste to the city. And from thence, they say, it comes that at this day, in a feast of Oscophoria, the herald is not crowned, but his staff, and all who are present at the libation cry out, Eleu iu iu, the first of which confused sounds is commonly used by men in haste, or at a triumph. The other is proper to people in consternation or disorder of mind. Theseus, after the funeral of his father, paid his vows to Apollo the 7th day of Pyanepsion, for on that day the youth that returned with him, safe from Crete, made their entry into the city. They say also that the custom of boiling pulse at this feast is derived from hence, because the young men that escaped put all that was left of their provision together, and boiling it in one common pot, feasted themselves with it, and ate it all up together. Hence also they carry in procession an olive branch bound about with wool, such as they then made use of in their supplications, which they call aeresione, crowned with all sorts of fruits, to signify that scarcity and barrenness was ceased, singing in their procession this song: Aeresione brings figs, and Aeresione bring loaves. Bring us honey in pints, and oil to rub on our bodies, a strong flagon of wine for all to go mellow to bed on. Although some hold opinion that this ceremony is retained in memory of the Heraclidae, who were thus entertained and brought up by the Athenians, but most are of the opinion which we have given above. The ship wherein Theseus and the youth of Athens returned had 30 oars, and was preserved by the Athenians down even to the time of Demetrius Phalereus. For they took away the old planks as they decayed, putting in new and stronger timber in their place, insomuch that this ship became a standing example among the philosophers for the logical question as to things that grow, one side holding that the ship remained the same, and the other contending that it was not the same. The feast was called Oscophoria, or the Feast of Boughs, which to this day the Athenians celebrate, was then first instituted by Theseus. For he took not with him the full number of virgins which by lot were to be carried away, but selected 2 youths of his acquaintance, of fair and womanish faces, but of a manly and forward spirit, and having, by frequent baths, and avoiding the heat and scorching of the sun, for the constant use of all the ointments and washes and dresses that serve to the adorning of the head, or smoothing the skin, or improving the complexion, in a manner changed them from what they were before, and having taught them farther to counterfeit the very voice and carriage and gait of virgins, so that there could not be the least difference perceived, he, undiscovered by any, put them into the number of the Athenian maids designed for Crete. At his return, he and these 2 youths led up a solemn procession, in the same habit that is now worn by those who carry the vine branches. Those branches they carry in honor of Bacchus and Ariadne, for the sake of their story before related, or rather because they happened to return in autumn, the time of gathering the grapes. The women whom they call demonophori, or supper carriers, are taken into these ceremonies and assist at the sacrifice, in remembrance and imitation of the mothers of the young men and virgins upon whom the lot fell. For thus they ran about bringing bread and meat to their children, and because the women then told their sons and daughters many tales and stories, to comfort and encourage them under the danger they were going upon. It has still continued a custom that at this feast old fables and tales should be told. For these particularities we are indebted to the history of Demon. There was then a place chosen out, and a temple erected in it to Theseus. And those families out of whom the tribute of the youth was gathered were appointed to pay a tax to the temple for sacrifices to him. And the house of the Phytalidae had the overseeing of these sacrifices, Theseus doing them that honor in recompense of their former hospitality. Now, after the death of his father Aegeus, forming in his mind a great and wonderful design, he gathered together all the inhabitants of Attica into one town, and made them one people of one city, whereas before they lived dispersed, and were not easy to assemble upon any affair for the common interest. Nay, differences and even wars often occurred between them, which he, by his persuasions, appeased, going from township to township, and from tribe to tribe. And those of a more private and mean condition, readily embracing such good advice, to those of greater power, he promised a commonwealth without monarchy, a democracy, or people's government, in which he should only be continued as their commander in war and the protector of their laws, all things else being equally distributed among them, and by this means brought a part of them over to his proposal. The rest, fearing his power, which was already grown very formidable, and knowing his courage and resolution, chose rather to be persuaded than forced into a compliance. He then dissolved all the distinct state houses, council halls, and magistracies, and built one common state house and council hall on the site of the present upper town, and gave the name of Athens to the whole state, ordaining a common feast and sacrifice, which he called Panathenaia, or the sacrifice of all the united Athenians. He instituted also another sacrifice called Metoitia, or Feast of Migration, which is yet celebrated on the 16th day of Hecatombaion. Then, as he had promised, he laid down his regal power and proceeded to order a commonwealth, entering upon this great work not without advice from the gods. For having sent to consult the oracle of Delphi concerning the fortune of his new government and city, he received this answer: Son of the Pythian maid, to your town the terms and fates my father gives of many states. Be not anxious nor afraid. The bladder will not fail so swim on the waves that compass him. Which oracle, they say, one of the Sibyls long after did in a manner repeat to the Athenians in this verse: The bladder may be dipped, but not be drowned. Farther yet designing to enlarge his city, he invited all strangers to come and enjoy equal privileges with the natives, and it is said that the common form, "Come hither, all ye people," was the words that Theseus proclaimed when he thus set up a commonwealth, in a manner, for all nations. Yet he did not suffer his state, by the promiscuous multitude that flowed in, to be turned into confusion, and be left without any order or degree, but was the first that divided the commonwealth into 3 distinct ranks: the noblemen, the husbandmen, and artificers. To the nobility he committed the care of religion, the choice of magistrates, the teaching and dispensing of the laws, and interpretation and direction in all sacred matters, the whole city being, as it were, reduced to an exact equality, the nobles excelling the rest in honor, the husbandmen in profit, and the artificers in number. And that Theseus was the first who, as Aristotle says, out of an inclination to popular government, parted with the regal power. Homer also seems to testify, in his catalogue of the ships, where he gives the name of people to the Athenians only. He also coined money, and stamped it with the image of an ox, either in memory of the Marathonian bull, or of Taurus, whom he vanquished, or else to put his people in mind to follow husbandry, and from this coin came the expression, so frequent among the Greeks, of a thing being worth 10 or 100 oxen. After this he joined Megara to Attica, and erected that famous pillar on the isthmus, which bears an inscription of 2 lines, showing the bounds of the 2 countries that meet there. On the east side the inscription is, "Peloponnesus there, Ionia here," and on the west side, "Peloponnesus here, Ionia there." He also instituted the games, in emulation of Hercules, being ambitious that as the Greeks, by that hero's appointment, celebrated the Olympian Games to the honor of Jupiter, so by his institution they should celebrate the Isthmian to the honor of Neptune. For those that were there before observed, dedicated to Melicerta, were performed privately in the night, and had the form rather of a religious rite than of an open spectacle or public feast. There are some who say that the Isthmian Games were first instituted in memory of Sciron, Theseus thus making expiation for his death, upon account of the nearness of kindred between them. Sciron being the son of Canethus and Heniocha, the daughter of Pythias, though others write that Cenice, not Sciron, was their son, and that to his honor, and not to the others, these games were ordained by Theseus. At the same time he made an agreement with the Corinthians that they should allow those that came from Athens to the celebration of the Isthmian Games as much space of honor before the rest to behold the spectacle in, as the sail of the ship that brought them thither, stretched to its full extent, could cover. So Hellanicus and Andro of Helicarnassus have established. Concerning his voyage into the Euxine Sea, Philochorus and some others write that he made it with Hercules, offering him his service in the war against the Amazons, and had Antiope given him for the reward of his valor. But the greater number, of whom are Pherecydes, Hellanicus, and Herodorus, write that he made this voyage many years after Hercules, with a navy under his own command, and took the Amazon prisoner, the more probable story, for we do not read that any other, of all those that accompanied him in this action, took any Amazon prisoner. Bion adds that, to take her, he had to use deceit and fly away. For the Amazons, he says, being naturally lovers of men, were so far from avoiding Theseus when he touched upon their coasts, that they sent him presents to his ship. But he, having invited Antiope, who brought them to come aboard, immediately set sail and carried her away. An author named Menecrates, that wrote the history of Nike and Bithynia, adds that Theseus, having Antiope aboard his vessel, cruised for some time about those coasts, and that there were in the same ship 3 young men of Athens that accompanied him on this voyage, all brothers, whose names were Euneus, Thoas, and Soloan. The last of these fell desperately in love with Antiope, and escaping the notice of the rest, revealed the secret only to one of his most intimate acquaintances, and the employed him to disclose his passion to Antiope. She rejected his pretenses with very positive denial, yet treated the matter with much gentleness and discretion, and made no complaint to Theseus of anything that had happened. But Soloan, the thing being desperate, leaped into a river near the seaside and drowned himself. As soon as Theseus was acquainted with his death, and his unhappy love that was the cause of it, he was extremely distressed, and in the height of his grief an oracle which he had formerly received at Delphi came into his mind. For he had been commanded by the priestess of Apollo Pythias that wherever in a strange land he was most sorrowful and under the greatest affliction, he should build a city there, and leave some of his followers to be governors of the place. For this cause he there founded a city, which he called from the name of Apollo, Pythopolis, and in honor of the unfortunate youth he named the river that runs by it Soloan, and left the two surviving brothers entrusted with the care of the government and laws, joining with them Hermas, one of the nobility of Athens, from whom a place in the city is called the House of Hermas, though by an error in the accent it has been taken for the House of Hermes or Mercury, and the honor that was designed to the hero transferred to the god. This was the origin and cause of the Amazonian invasion of Attica, which would seem to have been no slight or womanish enterprise. For it is impossible that they should have placed their camp in the very city, and joined battle close by the Pnyx and the hill called Museum, unless, having first conquered the country round about, they had thus with impunity advanced to the city. That they made so long a journey by land, and passed to the Cimmerian Bosphorus when frozen, as Hellanicus writes, is difficult to be believed. That they encamped all but in the city is certain, and may be sufficiently confirmed by the names that the places hereabout yet retain, and the graves and monuments of those that fell in the battle. Both armies being in sight, there was a long pause and doubt on each side which should give the first onset. At last Theseus, having sacrificed to fear, in obedience to the command of an oracle he had received, gave them battle. And this happened in the month of Boedromion, in which to this very day the Athenians celebrate the feast Boedromia. Clymedas, desirous to be very circumstantial, writes that the left wing of the Amazons moved towards the place which is yet called Amazonium, and the right towards the Pnyx, near Crissa, that with this wing the Athenians, issuing from behind the Museum, engaged, and that the graves of those that were slain are to be seen in the street that leads to the gate called the Pyraic, by the chapel of the hero Chalcodon, and that here the Athenians were routed, and gave way before the women, as far as to the temple of the Furies. But, fresh supplies coming in from the Palladium, Ardetus, and the Lyceum, they charged their right wing, and beat them back into their tents, in which action a great number of the Amazons were slain. At length, after 4 months, a peace was concluded between them by the mediation of Hippolyta, for so this historian calls the Amazon whom Theseus married, and not Antiope, though others write that she was slain with a dart by Molpadia, while fighting by Theseus's side, and that the pillar which stands by the temple of Olympian Earth was erected to her honor. Nor is it to be wondered at that in events of such antiquity history should be in disorder. For indeed, we are also told that those of the Amazons that were wounded were privately sent away by Antiope to Chalcis, where many by her care recovered. But some that died were buried there in the place that is to this time called Amazonium. That this war, however, was ended by a treaty is evident, both from the name of the place adjoining to the temple of Theseus, called, from the solemn oath there taken, Orchomosium, and also from the ancient sacrifice which used to be celebrated to the Amazons the day before the feast of Theseus. The Megarians also show a spot in their city where some Amazons were buried, on the way from the market to a place called Rus, where the building in the shape of a lozenge stands. It is said likewise that others of them were slain near Charonia, and buried near the little rivulet, formerly called Thermodon, but now Haemon, of which an account is given in the life of Demosthenes. It appears further that the passage of the Amazons through Thessaly was not without opposition, for there are yet shown many tombs of them near Scotussa and Cynoscephalae. This is as much as is worth telling concerning the Amazons. The account which the author of the poem called the Theseid gives of this rising of the Amazons, how Antiope, to revenge herself upon Theseus for refusing her and marrying Phaedra, came down upon the city with her train of Amazons, whom Hercules slew, is manifestly nothing else but fable and invention. It is true indeed that Theseus married Phaedra, but that was after the death of Antiope, by whom he had a son called Hippolytus, or as Pindar writes, Demophon. The calamities which befell Phaedra and this son, since none of the historians have contradicted the tragic poets that have written of them, we must suppose happened as represented uniformly by them. There are also other traditions of the marriages of Theseus, neither honorable in their occasions nor fortunate in their events, which yet were never represented in the Greek plays. For he is said to have carried off Anaxo, a Trozenian, and, having slain Cenice and Circon, to have ravished their daughters, to have married Periboa, the mother of Ajax, and then Pheraboa, and then Iope, the daughter of Iphicles. And further, he is accused of deserting Ariadne, as is before related, being in love with Ego, the daughter of Panopeus, neither justly nor honorably. And lastly, of the rape of Helen, which filled all Attica with war and blood, and was in the end the occasion of his banishment and death, as will presently be related. Herodotus is of opinion that though there were many famous expeditions undertaken by the bravest men of his time, yet Theseus never joined in any of them, once only excepted with the Lapithae in their war against the Centaurs. But others say that he accompanied Jason to Colchis and Meleager, to the slaying of the Caledonian boar, and that hence it came to be a proverb not without Theseus. That he himself, however, without aid of any one, performed many glorious exploits, and that from him began the saying, "He is a second Hercules." He also joined Adrastus in recovering the bodies of those that were slain before Thebes, but not as Euripides in his tragedy says, by force of arms, but by persuasion and mutual agreement and composition, for so the greater part of the historians write. Philochorus adds further that this was the first treaty that ever was made for the recovering the bodies of the dead. But in the history of Hercules it is shown that it was he who first gave leave to his enemies to carry off their slain. The burying places of the most part are yet to be seen in the village called Eleutherae, those of the commanders at Eleusis, where Theseus allotted them a place to oblige Adrastus. The story of Euripides in his Suppliants is disproved by Aeschylus in his Eleusinians, where Theseus himself relates the facts, as here told. The celebrated friendship between Theseus and Pirithous is said to have been thus begun, the fame of the strength and valor of Theseus being spread through Greece. Pirithous was desirous to make a trial and proof of it himself, and to this end seized a herd of oxen which belonged to Theseus, and was driving them away from Marathon. And when news was brought that Theseus pursued him in arms, he did not fly, but turned back and went to meet him. But as soon as they had viewed one another, each so admired the gracefulness and beauty, and was seized with such a respect for the courage of the other, that they forgot all thoughts of fighting. And Pirithous, first stretching out his hand to Theseus, bade him be judge in this case himself, and promised to submit willingly to any penalty he should impose. But Theseus not only forgave him all, but entreated him to be his friend and brother in arms, and they ratified their friendship by oaths. After this, Pirithous married Didamia and invited Theseus to the wedding, entreating him to come and see his country and make acquaintance with the Lapithae. He had at the same time invited the centaurs to the feast, who, growing hot with wine and beginning to be insolent and wild, and offering violence to the women, the Lapithae took immediate revenge upon them, slaying many of them upon the place, and afterwards, having overcome them in battle, drove the whole race of them out of their country, Theseus all along taking their part and fighting on their side. But Herodorus gives us a different relation of these things, that Theseus came not to the assistance of the Lapithae till the war was already begun, and that it was in this journey that he had his first sight of Hercules, having made it his business to find him out at Trachis, where he had chosen to rest himself after all his wanderings and his labors, and that this interview was honorably performed on each part, with extreme respect, goodwill, and admiration of each other. Yet it is more credible, as others write, that there were before frequent interviews between them, and that it was by the means of Theseus that Hercules was initiated at Eleusis, and purified before initiation upon account of several rash actions of his former life. Theseus was now 50 years old, as Hellanicus states, when he carried off Helen, who was yet too young to be married. Some writers, to take away this accusation of one of the greatest crimes laid to his charge, saying that he did not steal away Helen himself, but that Edus and Lyncaeus were the ravishers, who brought her to him and committed her to his charge, and that therefore he refused to restore her at the demand of Castor and Pollux. Or indeed, they say her own father, Tyndarus, had sent her to be kept by him for fear of Enorophorus, the son of Hippocoon, who would have carried her away by force when she was yet a child. But the most probable account, and that which has most witnesses on its side, is this. Theseus and Pirithous went both together to Sparta, and having seized the young lady as she was dancing in the temple of Diana Orthia, fled away with her. There were presently men-at-arms sent to pursue, but they followed no further than to Tegea, and Theseus and Pirithous, being now out of danger, having passed through Peloponnesus, made an agreement between themselves, that he to whom the lot should fall should have Helen to his wife, but should be obliged to assist in procuring another for his friend. The lot fell upon Theseus, who conveyed her to Aphidne, not being yet marriageable, and delivered her to one of his allies, called Aphidnus, and having sent his mother Ethra after to take care of her, desired him to keep them so secretly, that none might know where they were, which done, to return the same service to his friend Pirithous, he accompanied him in his journey to Epirus, in order to steal away the king of the Molossians' daughter. The king, his own name being Aidoneus or Pluto, called his wife Proserpina, and his daughter Cora, and a great dog which he kept Cerberus, with whom he ordered all that came as suitors to his daughter to fight, and promised her to him that should overcome the beast. But having been informed that the design of Pirithous and his companion was not to court his daughter, but to force her away, he caused them both to be seized, and threw Pirithous to be torn to pieces by his dog, and put Theseus in prison and kept him. About this time Menestheus, the son of Peteus, grandson of Orneus, and great-grandson to Erechtheus, the first man that is recorded to have affected popularity and ingratiated himself with the multitude, stirred up and exasperated the most eminent men of the city, who had long borne a secret grudge to Theseus, conceiving that he had robbed them of their several little kingdoms and lordships, and, having pent them all up in one city, was using them as his subjects and slaves. He put also the meaner people into commotion, telling them that, deluded with a mere dream of liberty, though indeed they were deprived both of that and of their proper homes and religious usages, instead of many good and gracious kings of their own, they had given themselves up to be lorded over by a newcomer and a stranger. Whilst he was thus busied in infecting the minds of the citizens, the war that Castor and Pollux brought against Athens came very opportunely to further the sedition he had been promoting, and some say that he, by his persuasions, was wholly the cause of their invading the city. At their first approach, they committed no acts of hostility, but peaceably demanded their sister Helen. But the Athenians returning answer that they neither had her there, nor knew where she was disposed of, they prepared to assault the city, when Academus, having, by whatever means, found it out, disclosed to them that she was secretly kept at Aphidne, for which reason he was both highly honored during his life by Castor and Pollux and the Lacedaemonians, when often in aftertimes they made incursions into Attica, and destroyed all the country round about, spared the academy,